photographer John Orth have to be deeply thanked by me on behalf of the Bronx for bringing it the great satisfaction of remembering something that it has forgotten, okay? There's a lot that the Bronx has forgotten about its own culture, its first immigrant populations, and its importance in the constellation of Greater New York. And today we'll remember one of its greatnesses, the presence of the Piccirilli studio. And to explain what that is and who they are, here is Bill and Mary Carroll.
Now, is somebody going to do the lights? Okay, David.
I have to find group one.
That's the lights, I guess. Okay, great. Our subject today, as David has said, is the Piccirilli studio, which was located in the South Bronx from 1890 to 1945. This is the studio exterior. The family, which consisted of parents, a mother and a father, 6 brothers, 1 sister, arrived in New York City in 1887 from Italy, where their father was a sculptor and a stone carver. They work in Manhattan for a time for Adler Monument and Granite Works. And then their mother becomes ill, and they are forced to move to the country. And believe it or not, the Bronx was then the country.
The family at that time had two brownstones built at 142nd Street near Brook Avenue. The one on the right is actually a residence, and just to the left of that, it looks like another brownstone, but it's actually a studio. That large arched doorway was used to move marble blocks into the studio, and right behind that doorway was a huge freight elevator that carried the marble up to the 2nd floor. There were skylights from the front of the building all the way back, and after the work was finished, the marble was transported down the elevator to the street level and then shipped to the location. That wide, low studio wasn't built until a few years later in 1905. In these buildings, some of the country's best-known stone sculptures originated. Often they were carved for other sculptors, but many others were original Piccirilli sculptures.
Just before they moved to the Bronx, they met Daniel Chester French, who was beginning to flourish as one of America's leading sculptors. Like many other sculptors of the day, he didn't do his own stone carving. He liked the brothers' work so much that over the next 40 years, all but 2 of Daniel Chester French's works were carved by the Piccirilli brothers. An early large-scale carving project that they did was the U.S. Custom House, which you all may recognize. It's in Bowling Green in Lower Manhattan. Currently, it's the Museum of the American Indian. Cass Gilbert designed this monumental Beaux-Arts building. He also did the Woolworth building, and this is quite a different sort of design. As you see, on the street level, there were 4 statues that were carved by the Piccirillis for Daniel Chester French. These are the 4 continents, Asia, Africa, America, I have it backward, Asia, America, Europe, and Africa. Before income taxes in America, a major source of revenue for the federal government were tariffs and taxes obtained from foreign shippers entering the port of New York. And so this elaborate building housed the offices that processed these funds.
This is the sculpture representing the American continent, and it's a very vigorous young woman with an American Indian behind her right shoulder, and below her left arm is a male figure representing labor. And this is Europe, by contrast, rather regal and staid looking. And behind that sculpture of Europe is another figure. It happens to be
You need to speak into the mic.
an elderly man who represents ancient history.
Over the years, the brothers carved numerous sculptures for Daniel Chester French, as we said, but the largest single sculpture that they did required 28 blocks of white Georgia marble weighing a total of 150 tons. The pieces were carved separately over a period of 1 year in the studio and then transported by train over 200 miles to Washington, D.C. in 1920. They were put together flawlessly to form the colossal Lincoln Memorial.
Some of the men are probably Piccirilli brothers, but we're not certain. We haven't been able to confirm that. The Lincoln sculpture is 19 feet tall from head to toe. The model that they worked with from Daniel Chester French was 5 feet tall. And this is the early model that French supplied. It was modified later. The chair mainly was changed. This shows the six brothers in a 1930 magazine article. We discovered recently that the caption had the names mixed up. The only two brothers that we're certain of is Attilio in the long white coat and Getulio, the bald man on the left. Attilio was the artistic head of the studio. Getulio, an excellent stone carver, was the business head. As a matter of fact, the Lincoln Memorial was pretty much Getulio's baby. He was in charge of practically all of the carving. The other brothers were Furio, Ferruccio, Orazio, and Masaniello.
When I first heard of the Piccirilli brothers and I heard these beautiful Italian names, and Bill and I were speaking about the somehow commemorating them, the first thing that came to my mind was that it would make a great Broadway musical, the dancing, singing Piccirilli brothers, but I don't know whether that will ever happen.
Yeah.
Maybe not next year.
This is one of Attilio's earliest commissions for an original sculpture. It's located in New Orleans. It's called the McDonough Memorial. McDonough. McDonough was a very wealthy individual, and he left a large part of his fortune for the children of New Orleans. And the children are shown placing flowers at the base of the bust of McDonough.
We think this is quite lovely, the gracefulness of it.
I have to explain to you that only this mic is picking up.
It is? Oh, okay.
Okay,
All right.
thank
We
you.
didn't know that. All right. The next slide is the main monument. Does anyone know where this is located? Right. The southwestern corner of Central Park near Columbus Circle. It was Attilio's largest sculpture. Attilio's own sculpture, 64 feet tall.
His design was chosen in a competition held in 1902 among 40 other sculptors. The monument, of course, commemorates the sinking of the battleship Maine in 1898. Funds were raised partly by public subscription organized in 1898 by William Randolph Hearst and his New York newspaper, The Journal, which later became the Journal American. And of course, the movie Citizen Kane is based partly on the life of William Randolph Hearst.
There's an interesting story about this monument. It was originally supposed to be installed in Times Square, where the tickets booth is now located. A clerical error, however, resulted in a public toilet being built at that site. Would that it were there now. The monument was relocated to its present site. Some historians think that the clerical error was instigated by the New York Times to avoid having a Hearst monument in their backyard. We might call this an early case of NIMBY, and it was probably a New York Times person who invented that word, by the way.
This figure is at the base of the monument on the right-hand side, and it's one of our favorites. It represents the Atlantic Ocean, and it's based on an ancient sculpture of a river god. These sculptures are located at the front of the memorial, and the figure on the left is based on a Michelangelo figure in the Medici Chapel in Italy, I think in Florence. And the figure on the right is the mother and child called Fortitude. It's another one of our favorites.
Right.
And a copy of this is in the William Randolph Hearst collection at San Simeon in California.
Okay. The Firemen's Memorial was another Piccirilli project, which was also unveiled in 1913. Some of you may know this as well. It's at 100th and Riverside Drive.
The bas-relief that you see there is in bronze. Originally it was marble, but deterioration required its replacement by a bronze casting, and that was done in the 1930s during a renovation. And you can see from here perhaps two stone figures, one on the north side, one on the south side. That's the close-up of the bronze. Now here is the figure on the north side. It's called Courage. Reminds us of Michelangelo's Pietà.
The mother and the child in the next one is called Duty, and is only slightly different from Fortitude in the main monument. Notice, if you will, the helmet and the hydrant in this statue. The interesting point is that every year still the firemen lay a wreath at the statue once a year in a ceremony to commemorate all the firemen who've been lost in the line of duty.
This is another mother and child figure, and it appears at the family plot, the Piccirilli family plot in Woodlawn Cemetery in the North Bronx. Unlike the other mother and child sculptures, this is in bronze, and unfortunately it's been deteriorating pretty badly. I'm not sure what the plans are for restoring this sculpture.
The next
Also,
one.
in Woodlawn, we just discovered this recently.
Yes.
This is at the grave of Nathan Piccirilli, who was Orazio's son. Nathan was a World War II member of the armed forces and was killed during the war. And this is a copy of a figure called the Outcast, which was originally installed at St. Mark's Church in the Bowery, and it's disappeared. The people at St. Mark's don't know where it is, but this one is a copy. It's not the one that was in St. Mark's. There was a fire at St. Mark's 20 years ago, and they think that maybe it got destroyed. But fortunately, we found this copy, which is in Woodlawn Cemetery.
This bronze relief, sculpted by Attilio, marks the grave of Fiorello LaGuardia's first wife, who died 1 month after their 1-year-old daughter, Fioretta, died. This also is in Woodlawn. Fiorello LaGuardia and Attilio were best friends for over 40 years. Fiorello, in fact, wrote the preface for Attilio's biography. The Little Flower, as Fiorello was called, he was a mayor of New York for you youngsters out there. He called Attilio Uncle Peach. That was his name for him, presumably, I guess, because of the pronunciation of Piccirilli. While LaGuardia was mayor, Attilio went to Gracie Mansion virtually every Sunday night for dinner. And in other times, when he was not mayor, they met at the studio once a week. Attilio loved to cook, and he prepared great Italian food, which they went out and shopped for on Arthur Avenue.
This is a photo of Attilio in the studio working on a sculpture which was to be called the Broken Vase. And this is how all traditional sculptures work. They begin with clay, and then from the clay they make a plastic cast, and from the plastic cast they either make a bronze casting or a marble carving. Most of Attilio's work, of course, was marble carving. However, this piece was cast in bronze, and it's located at the New York Academy of Art at Fifth Avenue and 91st Street.
There's an interesting story, too, about this model that he used. He noticed in the process of doing this that her body kept changing from week to week very subtly. Every time he'd see her, it was slightly different. And he sat her down for a cup of tea. This was 1916 or something like that. Sat her down for a cup of tea and very tactfully discovered that she was pregnant. And she had a beau, but they didn't have enough money to get married, and she was feeling rather desperate. Well, Attilio put two and two together because the day before, a young man had come knocking at his door looking for a job, a young sculptor looking for any job. I'll do anything. And then he realized, after he spoke with the model, that that man was this young woman's beau. And so he promptly gave him a job so that they could get on with their life together.
And this is the bronze casting that's at the National Academy. This is another photo from the interior of the studio, I think fairly early on, 1907, I believe. And this shows in the background a small plastic cast by Daniel Chester French of a figure called Commerce, and it's in the process of being carved in stone. And the carving is not quite complete. You can see quite a few chisel marks. What the brothers did, normally they use a device called a pointing jig, which transferred accurately any given point from the original plastic cast onto the marble block. And then using drills and power tools, they were able to locate the points on the piece that was being copied. And the marble was cut away with the power tools, but a lot of time was spent finishing using mallets and chisels. And you can see some mallets and chisels on the blocks up front. You can also see some other tools, perhaps some calipers that were used to check measurements. But these final stages of creating the marble copy was crucial. The artistry of the carver was really important. And since the brothers themselves were sculptors, they usually carried out the projects to completion. The stone carving work was never signed. Of all these stone carving projects that the Piccirillis worked on, their signature doesn't appear on a single piece. And in some cases, we believe that the sculptors simply didn't want the public to know that they didn't do their own stone carving. Ironically, a bronze casting always carries the name of the founder from the foundry, but in the stone carving, that's not the case.
Now, in our next slide, which you will recognize as well, the New York Public Library, another icon of learning. And there are the famous lions, sculpted, carved by Attilio at the studio and unveiled in 1911. The sculptor was Edward Potter. They also carved the 6 11-foot statues above the entrance. Paul Wayland Bartlett sculpted these. You see them up top there. Another icon of capitalism is the New York Stock Exchange. A very young Attilio, in his first major project, carved the pediment for the sculptor John Quincy Adams Ward. The original marble figures, however, began to deteriorate badly, and in 1936, they were replaced by lead-coated copper replicas. We have a close-up of that. You see them. You can't tell that they're not marble, though, can you? They look
Pretty close to
the same.
the original stone.
Right. Meanwhile, back in the Bronx.
Nearby here on Arthur Avenue, or right near Arthur Avenue, in a small park, is a marble bust of Columbus carved by Attilio. And remarkably, it seems to be graffiti-free. The Columbus bus was originally located in a park across the street from a school nearby Arthur Avenue, PS 45. I think it's called MS 45 these days. But in that same school is a Da Vinci bronze. And that bronze was cast in 1934 and was done by Attilio. And it turns out that we believe that this bronze was located above the doorway to the Da Vinci Art School. Attilio was co-founder of this art school, which was in existence in downtown Manhattan from 1923 to 1940. It had several locations. It moved from a location nearby St. Mark's in the Bowery to 34th Street and then to 16th Street. But we know someone that was a student at the school in the late 1930s when the school was in 16th Street, and he's pretty certain that that's the same figure. How it got to MS 45, we're not certain, except that the principal of MS 45, Angelo Patri, was another close friend of Attilio. So perhaps after the school closed, because of the Depression, we think, in 1940, the bust wound up at Angelo Patri's school.
This is a photo of the drawing class at the Da Vinci School in the 1930s. By the way, one of the most famous students to come out of the Da Vinci School was Isamu Noguchi, who is one of the premier 20th century sculptors in America. This is a photo, however, of a class, and Attilio is in that picture somewhere.
Yeah, let me see it.
In the suit in the back row.
Attilio.
There's Attilio, and the model in a suit is Primo Carnera, heavyweight boxing champion. The school received testimonials from numerous people, including Thomas Edison, Theodore Dreiser, Al Smith, Arturo Toscanini, Calvin Coolidge, Sherwood Anderson, Luigi Pirandello, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and our own Herbert Lehman. However, as Bill said, the school closed in 1940, probably a victim of the Depression.
In Brooklyn, the Brooklyn Museum has along the attic level, along the top, a total of 30 sculptures, all carved by the brothers. 2 of them were sculpted by Attilio. And at the street level, there are 2 bigger-than-life-size sculptures. We can see one here. And those 2 sculptures originally appeared at the entrance to the Manhattan Bridge. One was Manhattan, the other was Brooklyn. This is Manhattan, looking rather imperious and a little arrogant, perhaps. And Brooklyn, on the other hand, is looking kind of maternal. There's a child near her right leg studying. And you can't really see it in this slide, but there's also a sculpture of a church on her right side. So they're rather different figures. But this photo shows Manhattan in its original position at the entrance to the Manhattan Bridge. But back in the 1960s, the entrance to the bridge was altered, and both sculptures, this and Brooklyn, were moved to the Brooklyn Museum. This, of course, is the U.S. Capitol, and the brothers carved the pediment, which is over the entrance to the House of Representatives. And, of course, the dome for the Capitol was cast in the South Bronx. The Piccirillis had nothing to do with that. But they did carve the pediment, and we have another shot of the pediment. As this, the sculptor was Paul Wayland Bartlett. Also in Washington, unfortunately, this is not a very good slide. This is a fountain, and the top of the fountain is cut off. I took this picture. I take full blame for that. And it's in the center of a lively neighborhood in Washington, and It reminds me of Washington Square Park. It's a lovely little park, and it seems to be a natural center for the neighborhood, and the center of the park is this sculpture.
DuPont Fountain at DuPont Circle.
Sculpted by Daniel Chester French in 1921.
When the brothers weren't working on large projects of their own for others, they invariably sculpted their own smaller works, totally non-commissioned. In 1930, a reporter from the American magazine visited the studio, and I'd just like to read a short piece from her work. "It was odd," I said to Maso, "that you all made up your minds to be sculptors." "There is no mind to it," he said. "Our souls are all the same." Presently Attilio comes in. "Furio, Getulio, Maso," he calls as he pushes open the door. "We have won a prize in the exhibition of the National Academy of Design. The gold medal is given to Furio." "This ragged man wins the prize," Orazio shouts, and laughing, shouting, they all pummel the prize winner. But I could only think of what Attilio had said. We have won a prize. Not Furio has won a prize, not our brother has won, but we have won. It is Furio's black marble seal which has won the prize. A sea lion just rising from the water. It seemed to me I had heard before of a National Academy Prize in connection with the name of Piccirilli. "Didn't he win the same prize last year?" I asked. "Oh, that was Orazio with his black eagle," Maso explains. Then in the midst of laughter, Getulio rises, lifts his thick white cup. It is a signal for silence. In that rambling old kitchen, suddenly there is no sound but the brazen clacking of a clock on the wall, and from one of the studios, the echo of the steady beat of a hammer. "Furio," says Getulio, "we as brothers are proud of you." Nothing more. Just one moment of silent, solemn tribute, every cup lifted.
And this is Furio posing with Attilio and the seal. Furio's hat is made of folded newspaper, which the brothers traditionally wore in the studio, presumably to keep the marble dust out of their hair. And this is the same seal today in the American wing of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And right next to it is a piece called Fragilina, which Attilio sculpted. And it's an attempt by Attilio to portray an adolescent young woman growing through an awkward stage into graceful womanhood. And it's semi-abstract, slightly abstract. Of course, there are some pieces in the American wing that were carved by the Piccirillis. This is by Augustus St. Gordon's. It's a very lovely bas-relief, which the brothers carved, and there's another one that they carved as well. This, I think, is the Schiff children. Upstairs in the American wing, this is a memorial called the Millmore Memorial. A young sculptor died at the age of 39, and he's shown there being called by the Angel of Death. And this was extremely popular in the beginning of the century. The original is in a cemetery in Massachusetts, and this was a marble copy that Daniel Chester French asked the brothers to carve for the museum. And another piece in the American wing is Memory by Daniel Chester French. He considered this his masterpiece. He worked on it for upwards of 20 years, I believe, in the clay until he was finally happy with it, and the brothers carved this. Who should do this?
All right. This is the Washington Arch, in case anyone didn't know, in Greenwich Village. The brothers carved the two George Washingtons, which have deteriorated quite badly, but are being restored currently. Alexander Sterling Calder was the sculptor who did this Washington as president. And you may recognize his name because his son became a famous sculptor in his own right of mobiles, Alexander Calder. The arch was delayed for many reasons in its completion, including the famous murder of its architect, Stanford White. Now, here's a new slide. This is another interior photo of the studio. It's a little hard to see, but you can see Furio's seal in the foreground, and you can see Attilio's Fragilina in the background, and then there's this great little pot-bellied stove right there in the middle. Hit it. Here we are back at the studio. Every sculpture we saw today came out of these fairly unpretentious-looking buildings. The brothers' natural modesty kept the studio virtually unknown to the public. The studio, however, was well known in certain circles. It was visited by Presidents William Howard Taft, Theodore Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson. John D. Rockefeller visited often while Attilio was creating glass sculptures for Rockefeller Center.
Unfortunately, we don't have photos or slides of the glass sculptures. They're still there, but the shops in Rockefeller Center are being renovated, and the glass sculptures and the shops are behind plywood walls. But presumably sometime later on this year, that work will be finished, and Attilio's glass sculptures will be once again visible. Perhaps most important, though, 467 East 142nd Street was a well-known address to all of the great sculptors of their time. St. Gordon's and others actually lived there for weeks at a time. The studio was open to artists. It truly became a center for American sculpture. Albert Gardner, former curator for American sculpture at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, said, "The arrival of the Piccirilli family in New York may well mark an epoch in the history of American art."
The studio is a vacant lot today. This is it. The only thing left from the old photo is the fire hydrant.
The neighborhood is going through a renaissance with the construction of numerous one- or two-family houses. I grew up in the 40s and 50s, only a few blocks from the studio. That's one reason why I was attracted to this project. Another is that I'm an amateur sculptor. We're convinced that the Piccirilli story is too important to be forgotten. We've begun to talk with the Community Planning Board, the Councilman's Office, the Borough President's Office. Ideally, we'd like to see a park built on or near the studio site with some references to the work of the studio. We've also suggested a change to the street name and also perhaps a change to the name of a nearby school. We feel that the commemoration of the studio could play an important part in the rebirth of the South Bronx.
Wish us luck.
We'd like to express some thanks to a few people, and it's not everybody. Jerry Kappa, who is unfortunately not able to be here today, is a man in his 70s who knew the Piccirilli brothers extremely well. He was a student at the Leonardo da Vinci School. In 1939, he was 13 years old, and Attilio was in the habit of inviting gifted students to a studio to show them how professional sculptors worked. Jerry visited the studio that Saturday and every Saturday thereafter from 1939 until 1945 when Attilio died. So Jerry was able to fill us with a lot of information and some photographs that are extremely valuable to us. We'd also, speaking of photographs, like to express a warm thanks to John Orth. I don't know if John is here. He's in the back.
Standing in the back.
John is an expert photographer. He's a student at Lehman College, and he took many of the slides that we saw today. Beautifully done. Thanks, John.
Also, many thanks to David Beatty for allowing us to come and show this all to you today. If anybody has any questions, I think now is the time. We'd be glad to try to answer them. Yes?
Carefully.
How did they get the large sculptures? to Washington, D.C., how these mammoth pieces, is the question.
They were moved from the studio to the railroad terminal on trucks, and these were 27 pieces of Georgia marble. Before they were carved, they weighed 150 tons. I've seen the shipping records on that. After they were carved, somewhat less than 150 tons, but nevertheless, quite a bit. And then the railroads moved them over 200 miles to Washington, and I guess they were unloaded onto trucks there and brought over to the site of the Lincoln Memorial. And I understand when they were placed in position that the fit was flawless. Attilio was in charge of this, and it was a perfect fit. But I'm boggled too. I mean, I'd love to have seen an operation like that, but that in itself was quite an accomplishment.
Yes.
When the studio closed, did that mark the end of the brother's work?
When the studio closed, did that mark the end of the brothers' work?
The studio effectively closed in 1945. Two of the brothers died within 3 days of each other. Attilio, and then 3 days later, Attilio died. I think they had been in semi-retirement, for one thing. For another thing, the golden age of public sculpture in this country had ended. It ended, some people think, with the Lincoln Memorial in 1922. There was other public sculpture done during the 1930s, but some historians think that the golden age of public sculpture in this country was from 1882 with Augustus St. Gordon's Admiral Farragut in Madison Square Park downtown. That was the beginning of the golden age, and it ended in 1922 with the Lincoln Memorial. Certainly work was done after that, but by that time I think the brothers were getting on in years, not elderly. They might have been in their 50s and 60s, but I think they were retiring, and there was not much work to be done, and I think they were disappointed with that. But by 1945, two of the brothers died, and two other brothers had gone back to Italy to live indefinitely. They were there through World War II. And then the two youngest brothers died in the 1950s. Yes. Yeah.
Is that available in print?
Yes. It's available. It's not too easy to find. I think there's only one copy in the New York Public Library, and it's written by a man named Joseph Lombardo, Lombardo. In the 1940s, he was a professor at Queens College. And it's a good, thick biography, and it has a lot of information on Attilio, but nothing about the stone carving, only about Attilio's original works. But that's where we started. And we first found out about the biography at the Bronx County Historical Society. That was our first step in this project, to visit there. They had a thin file on the Piccirillis, but one of the pieces of information was about the biography. Yes? Attilio Piccirilli, an American sculptor.
Yes.
I'd just like to say that my father was one of the architects of the Louisiana State Capitol, and in the 1930s he came up to New York, and he spent a lot of time at the Piccirilli studio, and they did all the responsible for all the fine bronze work there. And also Attilio did one of the marble statues of a former Louisiana governor named Allen. And I have several, couple of books anyway about the Capitol, and pages on the Piccirillis, and a picture of Attilio and the carving the statue of Governor Allen. If you're interested.
Yes.
We'd love to see it.
Love to see it.
Our work on this project is not finished. But we keep coming up with new things. Several of the things that were shown here today, we just became aware of in the last month. For instance, the Da Vinci sculpture that's in PS 45, we didn't know about that until only 2 weeks ago. And Mr. Fasolino, assistant principal of the school, was gracious enough to give us permission to photograph it. We also just found the sculpture of the outcast at Nathan Piccirilli's grave, and that was only about 2 months ago, and that was sheer accident. I was looking through a book called Permanent New Yorkers, and it's about people buried in Woodlawn and also in Greenwood Cemetery. Get it? Permanent New Yorkers. And I looked in the P for Piccirilli, and I saw Nathan Piccirilli, never heard of him, and they made a reference to the sculpture, and I went over and looked at it, and I'm glad that I did. But these accidents keep happening.
John. John in the back. John.
If we had what?
I don't know, I can't hear you.
Yes, yeah, we showed that just before you got here, I think.
Yes.
Any idea who made the copy of the outcast?
Well, I'm not certain. Nathan Piccirilli died in 1944 during World War II. Attilio could very well have made the copy. He was still alive. He died in 1945. So it's possible he did it, but it's possible that one of the other brothers made a copy. I'm guessing that the outcast was, at that time, was in the churchyard of St. Mark's. There was probably a plaster cast in the studio. And for the brothers to make a copy was not such a big deal. And my hunch is that Attilio did it, but it could have been one of the other brothers.
What I find strange so far in our research is that from 6 brothers, there are so few descendants that we've found. It seems as though it ended in 1945, and that was it. And it's been hard to pick up the few threads of descendants. There are a couple that we've tracked down, but they're quite old now. And to me, it's strange that no one in the family of the next generation really took. I think one of the brother's sons did become a sculptor for a while, I believe, but he died. And so there hasn't been it's partly why they went into obscurity, I think, that there has been no family sense of continuity of this whole legend. So that's intriguing to me, and I certainly want to continue to dig. I'm getting a website together, and I'm trying to put the word out there. If anyone has any information on the Piccirillis, to please, contact us.
One other thing that made the work fairly difficult was that we were never able to locate the business records from the Piccirilli studio. We thought, well, one day we'll find those, and we'll be able to figure out pretty easily which ones they did, which ones they didn't, when they did them, and so on. But we've never found those records. And one person that knows quite a bit about the Piccirilli brothers, she's not here today, Janice Connor. She's an art dealer on 73rd and Madison. She told us that she had heard, she thought from a family member in research she was doing 10 or 15 years ago, that the day after Attilio died, the business records were destroyed, which really puzzles us. I don't think that they were trying to evade income tax or anything like that, because they were real, ideal American citizens. Attilio won the Thomas Jefferson Medal in the 1930s and so on. So it's a mystery.
Yes.
Yeah.
A number of puzzled by the Piccirilli business. You showed the picture of the grave with the statue of the mother and child.
Right.
But you didn't mention that there's no markers on the grave.
Right.
16
Right.
people are buried there.
That's right. Well, I did look at the records from Woodlawn Cemetery, and there's a little map showing where they are relative to that sculpture, but there are no name markers on that grave. And there's another famous grave site with a fabulous sculpture by Augustus St. Gaudens in Washington, and it's at the it was at Henry Adams' wife that committed suicide.
Yes,
right. It's a
right.
fabulous sculpture. And it's extremely well known, but that too has no indication of who's buried there. I mean, we happen to know that it was Henry Adams and his wife, but it doesn't say anything about them there either.
Any other questions? Yes.
Do you guys do this? Like, do you go speak places?
No, this is our first.
You're fantastic.
Oh, well, thank you, Clementine. Yes.
Always wondered two things. One is why Attilio wasn't known as a sculptor as well as someone who put other people's work into stone. And the other one is, was there never found any sense of competition between them and the people who work that put into models. I was wondering if you've ever heard anything on that or.
We know from Jerry Kappa, this man that Bill tracked down, who as a youth went to the studio, that that Attilio was a very, very modest man who lived a rather monk-like existence. He lived in the studio. If you read his biography, I think it's in the biography, you get the sense of someone who went to bed on a hard mallet, mat, not exactly that bad, but, lived very, very simply and monk-like. And so there's that. And then there's also, I've always felt that there was the class distinction of the time, too, that these were immigrant people. They were of a different class than the sculptors who were, by and large, John Quincy Adams, Ward, Daniel Chester French. They were the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant ascendancy in America. So there was some of that, but I think Bill can tell you the story, if you don't know it, about the Lincoln Memorial and how they were not, the Piccirilli brothers did not want to be memorialized there. There was some controversy over that, and I don't remember the details. Do you, Bill?
Yeah, it might have something to do with the other point that you mentioned about Attilio the sculptor and Attilio and his brothers the stone carvers. So we tried to include as many of his original sculptures as we could today. There are others that we didn't because of time limitations. But one story we were told about the Lincoln Memorial was that Daniel Chester French offered to the brothers to inscribe that piece, and no other pieces were inscribed. Inscribed Piccirilli brothers marble workers, and they declined. And I think that might have had something to do with the fact that they regarded themselves as marble workers, but they were also artists in their own right, with so much of the work, like the main monuments and the Firemen's Memorial. And
when you look at a statue like Memory of Daniel Chester French's in the Met, and you think, I mean, it's absolutely exquisite. And those men carved it. I mean, he brought them up a plaster mock-up that was yay big, and they carved this exquisite piece that was, yay big. And I mean, it's just, to me, it's always seemed like such a fine line between artisan and artist for the stone carver. And I can only think that it was the times in which they did it that created a kind of a separation.
Prior to the arrival of the Piccirillis, Daniel Chester French sent his plaster cast to Italy to be carved. He didn't do any stone carving whatsoever. So it was a real lucky day when he met the Piccirillis, because it expedited much of the work.
If you're interested in more of this, if any of you have not gone to Chesterwood up in the Berkshires, you can visit Daniel Chester French's estate there, and I think it's near Stockbridge, and they have a little kind of a museum you can tour, and they show the pointing techniques that the Piccirillis used and all that. I mean, you can get more information about Daniel Chester French and a little bit, perhaps, on the Piccirillis. Anything else? Yes, I can't see you. They hardly mention them. They do. It's very.
Yeah, if you look,
yeah.
you can find them, but
Right.
you have to look hard.
Yes.
We could put in some plugs for other matters. Susan, also the gallery is here, and the Lehman Gallery at the moment is putting together a register of public art in the Bronx, including all of the sculpture, which will be on a website as well.
Good.
And Professor Bergman in the front row here. Otherwise, a well-known expert on woodlawn cemeteries. Wrote the other book on woodlawn cemeteries, which is also certainly worth consulting for very local, important pieces of sculpture. Michelle Bogart, who spoke here last semester, is the great expert on the social and political implications of what's going on here, which I think are pretty fraught. The sculptors themselves were fighting desperately to distinguish themselves as professional artists, independent of the upper class, as you might say, painters. And at the border, there was a sort of a border war going on, and I think the Piccirillis were sort of trespassers on that border, something that made them very interesting and made them very closely tied to certain political networks in the city. Republican political networks in the city primarily, I think, and made them close to hers, but opposed to Pulitzer and so on. So if you want to follow that, her book is called Public Sculpture and Something Art in New York City, and the Civic Ideal, or something like that. Yes, Michelle Bogart, we have several copies in the library. Yes, John.
I would just like to add further, but I'd like to thank Bill for allowing me to work on this project with him. And would it be possible for you to give this lecture again here even for more students? How many would you say?
Now, don't expose our shame. They're all students. I invited them all.
If they'll come.
John, I want to point out that if you looked at, if you've been to lectures like this, you should realize that it's not easy to photograph sculpture. Architectural sculpture is particularly difficult to handle. And so even the student speaking in reproach of students, or maybe of teachers, is John Orth speaking in the back. He was, in fact, the photographer for all the original.